The honourable member for Carleton.
He believes that those who lost their jobs because of COVID shutdowns should have been helped with the CERB. But everyone should also believe that those hardworking people earning minimum wage, bagging groceries or doing other essential work shouldn't pay taxes to send CERB checks to prisoners or suspected fraud cases. And now we find that the government sent out 800,000 CERB checks to people who had not even filed taxes in the preceding year, failing to prove they were eligible for that money. What did the government do to ensure that the money didn't go to people who didn't earn the right to receive it?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our income support programs have played a fundamental role in getting Canadians through the first wave of the COVID crisis, and they're going to get Canadians through the second wave. When it comes to fraud, that is completely unacceptable, and the hardworking public servants in the CRA are doing an outstanding job, and they are going to make sure that all claims are legitimate.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
The comments. Well, stay tuned. We have more Pierre a little bit after, but first we have Mr. Chung. Great MP.
Mr. Speaker, today the Liberal government voted against the State of Israel at the UN General Assembly for a second year in a row, contrary to long-standing Canadian policy of opposing all resolutions that single out Israel, a policy that Prime Minister Paul Martin had put in place. Even Ambassador Ray said he disagreed with the preamble of the resolution. Why did the government break with long-standing Canadian policy and vote against the State of Israel at the UN General Assembly today?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me just be very clear. Israel is a close and important friend of Canada, and Canada will always stand with Israel. And let me also be very clear to Jewish Canadians in my riding and across the country. We stand with you, particularly today when we are seeing an appalling rise in anti-Semitism here and around the world.
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, last year, the Liberals broke with Canadian policy in pursuit of a UN Security Council seat. We all know how that ended. Canada lost the vote with 6 fewer votes than it received in 2010. A damning indictment of this government's foreign policy. That's 6 fewer countries that see Canada as a leader on the world stage today. When will this government restore Canada's long-standing opposition to these anti-Israel resolutions that were upheld by previous Liberal and Conservative governments and put in place by Prime Minister Paul Martin?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me speak to Canada's place in the world and to our foreign policy. We are living in a world today where there is a worrying rise of authoritarian regimes, a worrying rise of anti-democratic populism. And our country in that world will always stand up for human rights and will always stand up for the rules-based international order. That may not always be popular, Mr. Speaker, but that is the Canadian way.
The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le. Together, we're facing the COVID-19 crisis. But the climate crisis continues, and people are concerned. In 2017, the first bill to deal with climate change was put forth by Jack Layton, but he would not be in agreement, wouldn't have been in agreement with the Liberal Party's decision to wait so long to take action. People are concerned now, and they're concerned about the future of the planet. Will the Prime Minister commit to fight the climate crisis as if he really wants to make a difference? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I am very proud to say that Canadian legislation will require the federal government to respect its commitment to reach zero net emissions by 2050.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are all faced with the crisis of COVID-19, but the climate crisis is still there. People are worried about the future. In 2007, years ago, Jack Layton proposed the first of its kind bill to fight the climate crisis. But Jack wouldn't be satisfied with the Liberal government's proposal to wait 10 years before seeing any results. People are worried right now, and they want to see a real commitment. So will the Prime Minister commit to fighting the battle against the climate crisis as if he really wants to win?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course the Prime Minister will, and so will everyone on this side of the House. And let me ask respectfully the Leader of the NDP whether the NDP will commit to supporting the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. This is landmark legislation. It sets Canada on the path to net zero emissions by 2050. I am so proud of Canada for this legislation, and I hope all members of this House will support it.
Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, with the crisis that's happening in Nova Scotia with the lobster fishery, if there's one file, one decision that the Minister of Fisheries should have read by now, it's the Marshall decisions. Shockingly, yesterday at the Fisheries Committee, the Minister admitted she has never read them. How is it the Minister of Fisheries doesn't have the time or the interest to sit down and read and know the law on the most important file that she is dealing with?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to clarify that. Basically, what I was asked last night at Fisheries Committee was if I had read it in its entirety. I have read the Marshall decision. I needed more context on it. I went to legal experts as well as the member for Sydney Victoria, who is a treaties rights person, to give me more context on the decision. I have since finished reading that decision, Mr. Speaker. It's an extremely important one. But, Mr. Speaker, what's really important is making sure that we implement First Nations treaty rights. Thank you.
Member for Portage-Lisgar.
So she read it last night is basically what she's telling us. Mr. Speaker, commercial fishermen were calling for the minister's resignation weeks ago, and now Chief Sack is also calling on her to resign. Why? Well, she hasn't met with the Mi'kmaq fishers in a month. The fisheries minister doesn't have the time or interest to read the important legal decisions on her file, and now she can't be bothered to meet with commercial or Mi'kmaq fishers. So just exactly what is the fishery minister doing to fix the crisis that is literally threatening the backbone of Nova Scotia's economy?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have been actively meeting with both First Nations leadership as well as commercial harvesters since the onset of this issue. Mr. Speaker, I will continue to do that. I met with Chief Sack this morning, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker. I will continue to have those very important conversations. We know that the only way forward to make sure that we find a solution, a long-term solution to this issue, is through negotiations. Mr. Speaker, I will continue to have those conversations.
L'honorable député de Carleton.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Savez déjà que les libéraux ont...
Now, we know that the Liberals have sent CERB to prisoners. We also know that Liberals have told officials who suspected fraud to send out the checks nonetheless. Now we've learned that the government sent checks to people who hadn't even filed their taxes. So because an income of $5,000 was required in the previous year. So what is the government doing to ensure that everyone is eligible for the money that they've received to date? The Honourable Minister.
The honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians Canadians are paying more for food, and it could get worse this winter. Last March, grocery sales were up $2.5 billion over February. While grocery giants bank this windfall, they continue to gouge farmers and processors with fees that they say are because of the pandemic. Will the Prime Minister tell his rich grocery giant friends to stop gouging suppliers that are putting Canadian families' food security at risk?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the frustration the member has raised and the impact this is having on grocers and food producers and processors. They played a critical role during the pandemic, and as so have the essential workers across the country. And we share these concerns, and that's why we're going to continue to work with the provinces and territories to make sure we move forward in a manner to protect our workers and, more importantly, the supply chain when it comes to grocers.
The Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Protecting farmers and processors. Mr. Speaker, Loblaws want to gouge farmers and processors. Loblaws saw record third quarter profits of about $400 million. Metro fourth quarter profits were up 11.4%. But they want farmers and processors to pay for store expansions, while groceries for families from Streetsville, Point O'Barrel, and across Canada get more expensive. When will the Prime Minister tell his rich grocery giant friends to pay for store improvements out of their own windfalls and stop putting Canadian food security and affordability at risk?
The Honourable Minister.
The Honourable Member for a question. It is disappointing to see grocers impose these costly fees which fall on Canadian producers who are working hard to feed Canadians. We are open to discuss the issue at the next meeting of Ministers of Agriculture, which will take place shortly. However, contracts between suppliers and buyers are provincial and territorial jurisdictions. We encourage our provincial and territorial counterparts to examine this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.